Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the University of Manitoba Alumni and Friends Virtual Learning for Life series. This is our third session of a total of 9 weeks that we are together. We meet each Wednesday at this time, with exception to our final session, which is on Tuesday, June the 30th. My name is Tracy Bowman. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations and a proud alumna, and will be the moderator for this series. Today, we have over 730 alumni and friends who've registered for this session from around the world. Thank you for joining us and making this event part of your day, and in general for choosing to stay connected with your alma mater in this way. This program has traditionally been in person, geared towards our alumni friends audience in the Winnipeg area, but we've been able to expand it to all 145,000 alumni living in 140 countries around the world to participate. We've been able to offer this program free of charge to all alumni and friends, thanks to the very generous sponsorship of one of our affinity partners, IA Financial. Many thanks to them. Delivering learning for life opportunities is a very important role for the University of Manitoba, and we are proud that we are able to showcase so many of our leading professors, researchers, and alumni in this way. So just a few housekeeping details before I introduce our speakers today. You are viewing this webinar on a YouTube link, and you will be able to see both our presenters and their PowerPoint presentation. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website in the next day or two. You were also sent a link to Slido. The website is www.sli.do with the password 4706. And we are using that website, again, like in our other two sessions, for the question and answer portion. So you are welcome to pose your questions at any point over the next hour and a half. And then I, as the moderator, see those questions and will make them live. And then at the end, I will be asking those questions verbally to both of our presenters today. I would recommend that either you open a second window in your web browser on your computer, or alternatively, you could use another device to look at Slido on one, and then you can view this on YouTube in another device. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have Dr. Michael Yellowbird and Don McDonald, and the topic is mindfulness meditation. Dr. Yellowbird was appointed as the University of Manitoba's Dean of the Faculty of Social Work in the fall of 2019. He is a celebrated scholar, author, inspirational teacher, and passionate advocate for decolonization, Indigenous social innovation and creativity, and institutional and environmental systems change. And Dawn McDonald is a proud alumna with her master's in social work, and she's a fully certified teacher trainer of several contemporary mindfulness-based interventions. So with that, over to you, Dr. Yellowbird and Dawn.
Good afternoon, everyone. If it's afternoon where you're at, if not, good morning or good evening wherever you're at. It's really a pleasure for me to be here, and I think I speak on behalf of my colleague Don McDonald, that this is a topic that we're both very passionate about. I just want to again reiterate, the fact that if there are questions, we can take any questions, probably best at the end of the presentation, but we're happy if there are questions that are just too good to hold back to share those with us too as well. So we've put together just a very short presentation about mindfulness and meditation, and a little bit about the history. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the reasons we need mindfulness and meditation today, probably more than ever, and also what are some of the benefits we get from mindfulness. And my colleague Don will lead us through some practices today as we go along. So Don, you want to add anything at this point?
Oh, just so grateful to be here with you, Michael. Our history together goes back a few years now, and I'm so happy that you're here in Winnipeg, Manitoba with us. And thank you to all the alumni for being here. We're just honored to share this very timely practice with you.
So let me begin by saying this. I think one of the things that's always so interesting to me and compelling is the history we have as human beings. and a lot of that history that's been explored, and a lot of it that has been unexplored. So I want to talk a little bit about meditation and mindfulness and contemplative behavior. And just to, begin by saying that these practices have been a very important part of human evolution and have been around for tens of thousands of years. Mystics, religious leaders, ascetics, healers, all these different people that have been pursuing enlightenment, who have led this life of what they call renunciation from material possessions and physical pleasures, have spent time in isolation, concentrating, practicing prayers through what is the purpose of life? Many, many people have made, sorry. I don't know what happened to this screen here, but there. Sorry. Many people have made pilgrimages to these very, very sacred places around the world. I'm going to share with you one of my favorite places. And they go there to contemplate, to understanding one's place in the universe. In my own experience,
Have we lost our contact?
Yeah, we just lost him. I'll wait till he reconnects. I don't know if you want to keep going.
Yeah. So for everyone out there, while we're waiting for Michael, maybe we can actually make this real in just allowing yourself to feel your presence here in this moment. So from the contemporary training that I've had, this definition of mindfulness is really that it's our birthright. It's something that's within all of us, but it's also something that we have to access and train. Sometimes we've lost contact with the ability to pay attention on purpose in this moment, non-judgmentally, which is a definition that is often used that comes from Dr. John Kabat-Zinn, who created an intervention called mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is often credited for the burgeoning interest in contemporary mindfulness and long-time mindfulness throughout the world. So more than 40 years ago, he, having had the experience of engaging in very many contemplative traditions, had this idea that perhaps training individuals in healthcare, people whose medical conditions had them falling through the cracks, could engage them in a way in their own health and well-being that they could navigate the potential pitfalls of being in a system that really couldn't help them. So this program called mindfulness-based stress reduction is also known as participatory medicine. And the idea was to have people wake up to their lives, to wake up to their bodies, to wake up to what their hearts were calling them to, and to wake up to the functioning of the mind. So to build awareness of all of this by regaining our contemplative stance, regaining this capacity for us to actually notice what is happening. So in this moment, right here, right now, inviting you to actually become embodied, be in this body. James Joyce is often credited with saying that Mr. Duffy lived a little distance from his head, or from his body. It's the quote. So let's see if we can bring our attention right into the physical body in this moment. So feeling your feet on the floor, your cheeks in the seat, the strength of your spine, the head and neck balanced here on the body. And if you're willing and it feels okay to you, feels safe to you, just allow yourself to feel the fact that you're alive and pay attention to how you know it. Maybe you're noticing the warmth of your hands or sounds in the room, this ability to listen or to see. And one of the ways in which we train ourselves to become more present and aware is by the use of the breath. So just discovering this process of breathing that happens, thank goodness, without us having to pay attention. If I had to be responsible for remembering to breathe, I probably would have died a long time ago. But we can both be automatic with the breath and deliberate. So inviting yourself to feel that you're breathing. You might even take a few conscious deep breaths, signaling to the body that you're alive and well. And then just letting the breath return to its own natural rhythm and seeing if you can string one moment of attention on the entirety of one breath. I tell you, it's really, really hard. Because if you're like most people, the majority of the time, we're not actually present to what we're intending to be present to. The mind is wandering. There's a wonderful study done by a group of researchers led by Matt Killingsworth, in which they had iPhones. And at random times during the day, they would prompt people to get a call, and they would ask them, what are you doing? Were you aware of what you were doing? And then the really interesting question they asked is, how happy, how satisfied are you with this moment? And what was interesting is that for a majority of the time, nearly half the time, we're not present to what we're doing. We're somewhere else. Oh, you're back.
Yeah, when did I don't know what happened. I was really sort of going along with my, where did you lose me at?
We lost you very early in. So I was just leading a little bit of a brief practice.
Oh, yeah.
No, so perfect. Come on in. We hadn't gone past your first slide.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, do you remember the language? I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. Just dropped it.
That's okay. So we had seen the picture of the Grand Canyon, I think is where you were last speaking of.
Yeah, but do you remember the language I was talking about? Because I was reading a lot from a lot of my notes. So. Okay. All right. So let me just continue. I apologize. I'm not sure what happened to why the system went down, but so there are these, as I mentioned, sacred places, and I'm not sure if I should put it back up again because I might lose it. But let me see if I can try it again, and because I need to get back to the gosh, now we are a bit lost.
Yeah, you're frozen again, Michael. There, you're just in and out. So maybe you just don't share and see how that goes.
Okay, so maybe the slides aren't working. I'm not sure why they're not working. So that's unfortunate. So since I lost everyone now, I really apologize for that. That's technology for you. I guess that's why we should do these things out in the park, place where we're physically distanced from one another. So Grand Canyon is what I was talking about. I'm not sure where it cut off. So I'm going to just continue. So what I was talking about in terms of contemplation and mindfulness is that there are several of these sacred places all over North America that indigenous people call North America Turtle Island. And there's really a lot of evidence that, humans travel to these very sacred places where they go to contemplate, they go to meditate, they go to seek enlightenment, to expose themselves to the environment, to the climate, and deny themselves. They do this renunciation of all these things in order to reach this higher level of enlightenment. And this is something that the Buddha did, the same thing. I mean, the Buddha did that, and Don might want to talk about that too as well, but he had to find the middle way because he had gotten so involved in trying to find enlightenment that he had almost killed himself at least one time. So I wanted to say this about the history. The first actual evidence I was reading about, maybe Don has some information too, was a carving in caves in Tibet that were about 8,000 years old, where you see these ancient yogis sitting in what they call a full lotus position inside the cave. So about 8,000 years ago that folks were already doing a meditation, in the formal meditation in that part of the world. So meditation, mindfulness has been something that all cultures have done, and if we move a bit forward from that, then we come to the story of the Buddha. Don, did you want to say anything about the Buddha? I've got some stuff. Okay. No? Okay. So let me just kind of get through this piece here, because I think this was something that's always been compelling to me, was because it's, Buddha's finding his enlightenment as he goes along. But Buddha was born, like a lot of these sages, was born into very sacred circumstances. Tecumseh, the great Seneca leader, was born under the star, a comet that was, in the 1700s, late 1700s, and there was a sign in the sky, right? Jesus was born under signs, all these great leaders. And that's how Tecumseh got his name, the Panther in the Night, because the comet was going across. So are these signs that sort of indicate to people that, someone's born under a sacred sign, that they're probably going to be great leaders in life. And that's what happened to the Buddha. So the Buddha, of course, was raised in opulence in a palace. And he, I'll kind of fast forward, I won't tell the whole story, but he wanted to leave the palace and find out, what life was all about, because he had no knowledge of what life was outside the palace was, because his father forbid him to go outside the palace. So one day, him and his courier went out, and he began to see these signs. And in different days, he saw these signs, but things that really woke him up to suffering, right? The first person he saw when he went out, he had never seen a sick person before, but he saw a very sick person who was, very, very sick and on the age of, on the verge of death and so on. And he went back to contemplate that and asked his courier, it says, will this happen to me? And his courier said, yes, of course, one day, it won't happen very often, he said, because you have a good diet and you're well taken care of, but we all get sick. And then the next time he went out, he saw an old person, a very, aged person, barely moving along, just with a cane and walking very slowly, toothless and just really, really aged, very aged person. So again, he was struck down with fear and said, oh, wow, I've never seen an old person before, because that wasn't allowed in the castle where he was, or the palace where he was. Again, he asked that question, was told again, yes, you will get old, everyone gets old. And the next, so he contemplated that, became more fearful. The next time he went out from the palace, he snuck out like any teenager sneaking out of the palace, right? He snuck out and he saw a dead person for the first time. And that really moved him, Wow, death. Had never seen death before. Asked that same question, will I die? And again, his courier told him, his assistant told him, yes, of course. We all die, but you'll live a long life because, you're well taken care of. Who was sitting by the side of the road, in a meditative. But in some accounts, when he looked at this person, he could see that this person was lifted of his burdens. And that person was smiling, very impoverished, very thin, but very, very, free from suffering. And basically he said, that's what I want to be. And from that point on, then he left the palace and then began to seek, like we all do, seeking, right? So he went to different places, different people, and finally decided, he had to do this on his own. Wasn't getting the answers, even though he was learning all these advanced techniques and meditation and all these ascetic practices that were leading him to these transcendent places. He still had suffering in his soul. So then he decided he was going to seek enlightenment, and that he would not cease from doing it until he had achieved it, even if it was his death. Fortunately, he didn't die. He suffered along the way, and he, in the midst of all of this, at the end of all of this, he came up with what Buddhists now are referred to as the Four Noble Truths. And I'll just sort of paraphrase them very quickly. That we suffer as human beings. No matter if we live a quiet life or we live a very hard, difficult life with a lot of overstimulation, we suffer. There is suffering that exists. And, we're born, we suffer, we come into the world, and when we leave, we're suffering going out of the world. And there's a source of suffering. The source of suffering, according to some people who write the Buddha, are two things. One is the attachment to things that we're going to lose in our life. People are going to die. We're going to get old. We're going to lose things. And the other one is aversion, our dislike or distaste for things. I don't like this. I don't like that. I don't like this person. I don't like that situation. Those causes us suffering, right? And these are a couple of things that the Buddha talked about. I'm simplifying it, So I know my colleague Dawn she's a scholar in this area, so I'm just kind of picking my way through it. The one I really like, that I think holds so much promise, is that the third noble truth is freedom from suffering. Freedom from suffering is available in this lifetime, right? And how is it available? Through the practice of what the Buddha called the Eightfold Path, right? The right understanding of life, the right thoughts, the right speech, the right conduct, the right means to live, not oppressing others or even animals, or serving liquor and alcohol to people, causing pain in people's lives, the right mindfulness, being mindful of things, the right concentration, and finally the right effort are the Eightfold Path. And so these are the things that the Buddha that I came up with, that a lot of people spend a lifetime studying and just practicing to try to get those things right. So that's kind of like the origin of mindfulness and the origin of meditation in a very sort of condensed way. Dawn, do you have anything to add?
I think one of the things that I love most about the teachings that are the origination of all of these contemporary expressions is that the invitation not to trust anything we say, but to actually engage and see what's true for you too. So although we outline the Eightfold Noble Path or anything that we describe, the Buddha always said, do your own experiments, live into your own truth, discover for yourself how meaningful this can be. So that's part of what Michael and I are going to be talking about, is how to actually engage in a way that allows your inherent nature to be revealed to you so that you live the truth and authenticity of your own life. That's part of what mindfulness really is.
Great, wonderful. So, so I thought maybe, I know you were leading a practice, So do you want to finish that practice? Let's finish.
I would love to. So I was just telling you about this Matt Killingsworth study about pain, you know, how often our minds are actually not where we are, and how often we are distracted by perception, and perception that isn't often what we've chosen, the filters by which we see. So I had just invited you into your own body and to experience your aliveness. So let's resume that experience by just once again feeling the weight of your body wherever you're sitting or lying or standing. To experience your feet on the floor, your cheeks in the seat, the strength of your spine. And I love this phrase. It's just experiencing your inherent dignity. Experiencing your inherent dignity. And then entering in, like really discovering the experience of your breath in this moment, be it an in-breath or an out-breath. And as I said before, it's a remarkable feat to be able to stay, to harness your attention, to gather your attention, and have it rest on this experience of your breathing. But there's a certain freedom that comes when we do. But maybe for you, like for me, like for almost every human being, your mind has wandered. Maybe even 100 times since we began. And so the practice is actually to make a choice breath. Just this breath. And this one. And as Michael was naming the Eightfold Path, it's often called the middle way, a way in which we don't strive too hard to have perfection, which is one of the things that so many of us struggle with, the stress of striving. So if you find yourself striving to hang on to the experience of breathing, just let it go. Notice that your mind may have wandered, and you can note where your mind alighted to. And then when you're ready, just come back to being here. Just this, only this, just for right now. And then as you're ready, letting go of your attention on this breath. And as adult learners, we don't just learn by experiencing something, we learn by reflecting on experiencing something. And so just take a moment to notice, what is the quality of the body in this moment? What's the quality of the experience of emotion? And what's the quality of the mind, having spent just a few moments narrowing the focus of your attention, concentrating, if you will, on experiencing your aliveness? And then I'm going to turn it right back over to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Dawn.
You're welcome.
It's very satisfying. I always really appreciate the way Dawn sort of leads us through these practices. She's got such a calming voice and so knowledgeable about the about the processes. So the next section, after we talked about what mindful, sort of kind of how long it's been around in history and how people have contemplated, for thousands of years and gone to on these pilgrimages and have, in their own languages, in their own sort of cultures, these different ways they do those things. The next part of the conversation then is, why don't we all feel enlightened right now? What's all this about the stress in our lives, right? And I think it's, so important to begin to really investigate that, right? We can talk about that a bit and say, well, these are things that that exist in our lives. I've got my notes here, sorry. And these are some of the reasons that, we do have things like stress. Well, stress is actually normal, right? It's and anxiety and depression, but probably not for a long time have we had, as large societies, such high levels of anxiety and depression. The World Health Organization has declared, anxiety and depression, to be pandemics. COVID-19 is not your first pandemic. Your first pandemic is the anxiety and the depression on all the mood disorders that come from living in first world circumstances. All the demands, all the noise, all the excess stimulation that we get. We live in an environment, with all the stimulation, all the news, the negative stories, the negative communication create fear, uncertainty. They make us angry. They make us resentful, and we're overloaded. All we have to do is look at a billboard, and it triggers that overload and that fear. That's the way the brain works. The brain is constantly in a condition of surveillance in order to stay safe. It's looking for threats, right? That's how we evolved. We evolved to see beauty, but we all evolved to see a lot of the threats and dangers that exist. So what happens when we live in a world with all this anxiety, all this overstimulation, all this bad news? Well, then it does create the anxiety. What it does is it triggers in our body the need to raise our levels of neurochemicals like cortisol, which is an adrenaline-like factor that helps us run from the danger and escape from the danger. If you're sitting in the car driving along and you see a sign that doesn't support your political ideology or it's offensive to you or something that you would never do, and it triggers anger or frustration or it can trigger fear, then naturally your cortisol levels are going to go up. They're going up because they want you to get away from danger, right? And it zaps your energy once your cortisol levels go up, and they stay up. It zaps your energy. And you can take a look at that in society today, first world societies. First world societies have such a problem with what we call mismatched diseases, like diabetes, like heart disease and cancers, like hypertension and depression and anxiety. Those are all these mismatched diseases. Well, how do we get mismatched diseases? Well, I'll tell you about mismatch in just a second, but how we get them is that once we're in the state of shock or fear or we're running or stressed, the first thing we want to do after our cortisol levels stay high for too long is we need to replace that energy that's been used. It's like we haven't run a 100-meter dash away from the bear. We're running a 100-kilometer dash away from the bear. And that takes a lot of energy and calories. So the first thing the body and brain does is that it goes into the mode where it says, give me calorie-dense foods. Give me French fries and fat and fried foods and sugary drinks, and pretty soon we have a health crisis on our hands. Now, that's just not here in Canada or the United States or North America. This is all around the world. And that's what we do. We go to that, and that's our first place, and that's where things like mindful eating come into play, right? Or getting in touch with your body, right? right? So let me tell you a little bit about mismatched diseases, then we'll kind of go on from this, from the stressors that are there. I'm just trying to give you some important information about that. So we know that most of us, our ancestors, who were hunter-gatherers or traditional horticulture people, who before big farming and living in cities, lived in places for millions of years that were where they depended upon food sources that were, you know, kind of hit and miss, but they much healthier foods, and they drank only things like water, right? They were in much, much better physical and emotional health than we are today. So when we move from those places, and don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about an idyllic place where people didn't starve. They did. They starved to death. They had famines and starvation. But when disease, or when foods were, when there was enough food, they didn't hoard food. They ate the food, maybe had feast, and then they saved the foods, and then they learned how to sort of get their food and sort of spread it out through longer periods of time. So we evolved to fast too as well, and that's why all the mystics that have ever fasted, if you look at the Buddha, look at Jesus, look at all these people that are seeking enlightenment, fasting has been really part of our ceremonial life. All people, doesn't matter if you're Muslim or Christian, or if you're, you know, non-denominational or whatever, fasting is something that all people have done. So what are mismatched diseases? This is from Daniel Lieberman, who was an evolutionary biologist at Harvard University. I was just finished an article and I was citing him. He says that mismatched diseases occur because our bodies are poorly or inadequately adapted to the environment in which we now live. Here's an example he gives. Would be eating large amounts of sugar or being very physically inactive. Both of those lead to problems like diabetes and heart disease, and they make us sick. So mismatched diseases are diseases that are more modern in the sense that they're more prevalent or even novel or more severe because we don't live the way that our bodies are adapted to. So if you go back to the Buddha and you go back to all these people that were a few thousand years ago before the advent of farming and living in big cities, our DNA and our genes, we have evolved to have genes that we need to contemplate. We have the genetic as well as the neurobiological tools in our organs in our brain to engage in meditative practices like prayer, like gazing at the stars for hours, like becoming entranced by the fire. And we have the mechanisms that help us to benefit in so many ways in our mental and physical health. So when we live in the modern world with these diseases, then when we eat fatty calories and these rich foods, we don't just overeat. We gain weight. We get depressed. And then we end up with a disease. And then we're going to the doctor who rarely prescribes for us to do meditation or go on a pilgrimage or sit out there and gaze at the stars or these kinds of things like our ancestors did as a function of our healing, right? And so this is kind of what we're talking about, is mindfulness and meditation has a much larger context. Sitting is great. Walking mindfulness is great. And we know that sometimes some definitions of mindfulness say that we pay attention on purpose. But I also say that we pay attention accidentally when we see something just beautiful, right? It's not that we're going to, and that's the way we've evolved as humans. We don't have to say, well, I'm going to pay attention on purpose every morning to do my meditation. If all of a sudden something moves you and you're paying attention, that could be an accidental, way of being mindful. But just stay with it, and absorb it. The music, the sound, the sight, the formations, whatever it is. And this is how we combat the diseases of civilization. We call them mismatched diseases. So, Dawn, do you want to add anything?
Thank you, Michael. I love that you're bringing in this topic of savoring experience, right? But there was a opportunity where we can live our whole life and forget to look at the stars, right? And so it almost has to be deliberate. We have to actually include it in our purview, because when the drive that we've had to be successful, to acquire, to do things in our lives can also be an impediment to living life fully. And so this idea to both concentrate our attention, and then what Michael's talking about, opening up to the wonder of the world. It feels silly to say that we have to actually intentionally do that. But for many people in Western society, we've actually forgotten to be attuned to wonder. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, maybe it might be a great time to do another meditation where maybe a visualization about, I'll see if I can bring up the Grand Canyon again. And maybe you want to lead us through a visualization, Dawn. Let's see if I can do this. Let's see if I can do this here. Share my screen.
Excellent.
Okay.
So while Michael's looking for his screen, I'm just going to preface this practice by talking about the importance of actually nourishing ourselves, especially in the face of fear. And this pandemic has really awakened fear for many of us. It's an unprecedented experience in our lifetimes for many of us. And you might have heightened levels of cortisol, I know, and adrenaline and all the fear hormones that have been released. And so to counterbalance that, I'm going to invite you into a meditative experience that will have us rest in something that's inspiring. So,
can you see that? I'm sorry, can you see that screen, Dawn? Okay.
That's beautiful. So Michael, I might just invite you to mute yourself for a little bit so that we don't get some feedback. Oops, you changed the slide. There we go.
I'm not sure. Can you mute me?
Yes, you're there. You're good. It's perfect. So using the power of your mind right now, if you're willing, establishing yourself once again in the physical body. So feeling yourself here. Inviting you to recall a person or a place, or maybe even a four-legged creature, in whose company you have felt capable of being fully yourself. So Michael's trying to eliminate that label so that we can see the picture itself. So just let your mind's eye bring that situation to mind. A place in which there is a sacred connection, a connection to wonder. And allow yourself to have as many details as possible. Perhaps it's with a trusted mentor or friend. So imagining yourself sharing space with this person. You might even notice a natural smile coming to your mind. Or maybe it's a vista like the Grand Canyon, or a wide open prairie field. There's a place I know of near here, up near Riding Mountain, where in the summer the canola and the flax and the sky all meet. So just allowing yourself to feel that savoring, that interconnection, how these moments of connection live in our bones in a certain sort of way. And allow yourself to actually breathe that in with this next breath. And of course, as we know, more than half the time, even when we intentionally choose to remember something or think about something or be present to something, the mind will wander. And so do we just refresh our aim? Allow yourself once again to recall this experience of freedom, of appreciation, of beauty. So sometimes some of my teachers have talked about maybe there is no destination for enlightenment as a place, but rather a series of moments where you feel enlightened. And if we can string together a few of those moments, what a precious gift that is. So from this memory of feeling freedom, just allowing yourself to breathe this in. And if you're willing, on your out breath, imagine sharing that freedom with everyone around you. And we can experiment with offering that wish for freedom as widely as you care to in this moment. May those we love, those we know, those we have not yet met, the earth, the sky, all beings everywhere experience this freedom. And then as this short practice begins to draw to a close, letting go of the image. And once again, just dropping into the experience of sitting here, the wholeness of your body, from the tips of your toes to the top of your head, the sides of your body, the front, the back. Recognizing that even if there are some parts missing or parts added or parts not functioning the way you'd like them to, that there's more right with you than wrong with you in this moment. And then as you feel ready, perhaps on your next out breath, if your eyes have been closed, opening them. Michael, maybe you'll talk a little bit about what happens in the brain as we move towards meditation, for the results of meditation.
Talk a bit about what is mindfulness, and I think it's really important to remember that it's not only being aware of the present moment, but we are connected and influenced by a natural world. We have a genetic past of our ancestors that still operates in us today. That's where the mismatched diseases come from. Sometimes that's where the fears come from. Sometimes that's where the courage comes from. Sometimes that's where the inability to metabolize caffeine comes from, and that which is a situation I have from my ancestors. So I don't drink too much coffee. All these things affect us. We have inside of us, living too, a human microbiome, a whole great circle of life that is also part of our health that we have to be aware of and be mindful that we live in all these different concentric circles that are connected to one another. And mindfulness is just really this quality or state of being mindful. And what Don is talking about is we're maintaining a non-judgmental state of awareness, thoughts, emotions, experiences on a moment-to-moment basis. Also a state of awareness. I also say number 3, I didn't write it down here though, is it's also mindfulness can be a very judgmental state. It also can be, doesn't have to be on purpose. It can happen spontaneously. And so it really, really sort of changes. Dawn, can you see the slides? I'm sorry. Hello? Darn it.
Yes, I can. No, you're good. Yeah,
okay,
yes.
so I thought, when you didn't answer it, I thought, oh, I lost him again. Okay, so I'm going to continue to go on. Meditation is actually the practice of mindfulness, right? Concentrating on the word, on the practice, the focus on the sound or phrase, visualization, like we just did, movement, any of these kinds of things that we do, and concentrate on doing them, increase our awareness and enhance our spiritual and personal growth, promote relaxation, and so on. These are just, it's another sort of little model that I did that was the pieces, not judging the experience. And sometimes I put a slasher there saying judging it, yeah, too. And attachment, non-attachment, paying attention, acceptance, present moment awareness are all sort of part of the basic beginning of mindfulness. As you see in the corners there, the little skeleton in the green is kind of what we call the distraction demons. Don't pay attention, lose your concentration, lose your focus, hit your thumb with the hammer, right, or something, that kind of thing. So this is Thich Nhat Hanh, who is he's like 93 years old now. He's a Buddhist monk, Vietnamese, but also a very, very eminent scholar and teacher of mindfulness, and all the different kinds of mindfulness practices that are possible to do. Everything from sitting to loving kindness down there, and resilience practices, and so on. A lot of research that shows what mindfulness is helpful for: attention, compassion, regulating our emotions, calming us. There's a lot of good research, evidence-based. It also helps us preserve the aging brain, keeps the gray matter, white matter, in good abundance, reduces, the me center of the brain. It helps us be we. Good for, it's much better than, in many instances, than antidepressants. Leads to, as we were talking, Don mentioned earlier about the growth of gray matter and white matter in the brain. Just a few days of training improves concentration, reduces anxiety and social anxiety, can help with addictions. So I'm going to sort of scroll through these parts too, because we only have an hour and a half today, and just talk a little bit about the neurobiology of mindfulness. That through a lot of investigation, we know that very particular parts of the brain and the body are really affected. Structures change, function changes in the brain, and during different meditative states. And this is really a good thing, really a wonderful thing. So what we had mentioned earlier is that changes happen very fast. Only after 11 hours of mindfulness practice and training, we get positive growth in our white matter in the brain, which produces the connectivity between the brain, and the brain talks to itself, right? How it communicates its feelings, its emotions, its thinking, its fears, its logic, its rationalization, its prayer, anything that you do, right? Even touching heat or any of those kinds of things. This is why it's so important for those of us who are putting on those years, is that it's a very, very well tested, practice. A lot of evidence base. Actually, there is some research indicating too that the more and more we practice, the greater and greater not only brain volume matter that we get, but we also develop more neurons in a practice, not a practice, but as a result of what they call neurogenesis, right? We grow more neurons. Very, very important and protective for neurodegenerative diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's. If you have what they call neuronal growth, and you have what they call cognitive reserve, because you have more growth, chances are you're going to do much better as you get older. And that's been shown in a number of different kinds of studies now. More practice is even better. 45 minutes of practice per day for 8 weeks changes major brain structures associated with memory, sense of self, empathy, and stress, both short and long-term memory. And that's a good thing. Now, these are just very short studies. Imagine if we were doing it every day past 8 weeks for the rest of our lives. We would have such big gains and such great benefits. Other parts, like the insula part of the brain, is the side one up on the left. You're looking at the screen is the activated insula. The next picture to the right of it is the insula from the back. The insula, there are 2 of them, and then the other one is the top down. As you see the activation there, what it is that the insula mediates conflict in the body, but also is scanning the body for the physiological state. How am I feeling? And a lot of times we're not feeling well. We could, if we're getting a disease or an illness, we don't pay attention to it. This kind of practice helps us be more in touch with the physiological changes and states in the body. Also controls mental emotions and the regulation of the body's balance, heat balance, emotional balance. Enables one to control negative emotions, right? We're talking about that very early on, that part you didn't hear as I fell offline. There's also, in this particular slide, the connections you see here between the parietal, the tan up in the top, to the right, IGF down to, it's called top-down modulation because it starts with the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is sort of connecting, and then connecting all the way down to the seeing part, the occipital lobe. That's something we don't have to be too concerned about now because we don't have enough time to talk about it. But if you see this slide, people who do a lot of meditation have an enhanced ability to perceive the emotional, mental state of others. In fact, what it means is that, your level of emotional intelligence goes up and your mental intelligence of others goes up, right? You're better at reading people. And this is very, very important for all of our ancestors at one time when we lived in villages and tribes all over the world, was that we didn't need social workers. Anybody in the village had a high level of temporal parietal junction activation because of a lot of contemplative practices. So they could see if someone was sort of skidding off the road early on, or someone was feeling depressed or suicidal or anxiety ridden, right? Because people had trained themselves to have this high level of mental intelligence and emotional intelligence about other people. Today, it's hard to read others. We don't, we make a lot of mistakes sometimes when we try to read other folks. The last chart I'll show you is this brainwave graph. And the people that are meditating, kind of end up in the alpha wave level, very relaxed, deepening into meditation. And as we see the modulation in the brain, we know that anyone who reaches this level and has a lot of training, is that for most of us who don't do meditation, when we reach an alpha level, this nice kind of roll there of brain waves, then we get tired and fall asleep. But if you can imagine a person that's trained themselves in doing meditation for long periods of time and learned how to calm down these brain waves through different kinds of practices, then 24/7, a person could be wide awake, very alert, but the brain waves would be in a very, very nice, relaxed state and just kind of modulating along. If you go up higher, when you see the beta waves, a lot of us are sort of in that level until we go to bed, which is why we can't go to sleep very much. The gamma waves are, this is kind of a misnaming of a hyperwave or a gamma wave, because a gamma wave has a couple of functions. The one function is that we know that meditators who have meditated like 40,000 hours in their lifetime can achieve a gamma wave modulation. And really what that means in terms of when you look at the science of that is that it puts the brain in a state of maximal sensitivity. The brain is just so sensitive to things that are going on around it. The other thing it does to the brain too is that at that level, and I'm talking about meditation, I'm talking about mindfulness, when you become that skilled, is that the brain is using little or no power. So brain fatigue is something that, is not an issue like it would be if unless you were in a beta wave. So these are things that really change when we begin to do mindfulness practices, as we get deeper and deeper into that. And this is why, from a neurological, neurobiological perspective, that it's so good for our brains and our body. So I'm just going to end the show there and go back to everyone here. So,
Michael, I just love that you ended on that experiment with checking the brain waves, especially with experienced meditators. And I love the story of when they actually did this study. They recruited monks who had been practicing for so long, and they put the sensors on their heads, and the monks all started to laugh because if you don't hear the word heartfulness when you're saying mindfulness, then your definition is not complete, because they thought that the scientists should put the sensors on their heart, not on their heads. So mindfulness also has this quality of deep care and compassion in the world, and it isn't just about our cognitive selves. So I think we're going to see some kinds of questions now.
Yeah, so ready for any questions you have.
So thank you very much. We have just one question right now. I'm hoping some more will come in, but this is a really interesting one. It's, could you please speak about the criticism of mindfulness without ethics? This is sometimes called McMindfulness.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can sort of speak for just my part, and I know Don has thought about this a lot. I don't actually do mindfulness like kind of mainstream mindfulness. I'm much more leaning toward traditional indigenous mindfulness practices, contemplative practices. But I know it has the same effect. But in my worldview, I know that people don't reach these levels to be teachers at all unless the person has sort of lived life. On my reserve back in the States, that's pretty clear. Spiritual leaders are not young people necessarily. That's very rare. And in order to learn this, you become an apprentice to someone that teaches this sort of thing. So that's kind of from the standpoint, and I think that's why when you see Indigenous people, like First Nation people, it's kind of it's fairly closed yet. You can go to the ceremonies and you can engage in Indigenous mindfulness, but to become a practitioner requires a long, hard, arduous journey of learning. And then, of course, along the way, you have to gain the respect. You have to put in the miles. You have to do all these kinds of things. So I can see that what the question is talking about. Because last thing I'll say about it real quickly is a lot of people have done the same with Indigenous mindfulness. Is they've taken sweat lodges, for example, and run sweat lodges, and charge money for sweat lodges, and pretty soon they're running these sweat lodges, and it's a very sacred, kind of meditative practice for a lot of Indigenous people. So there's a lot of controversy around that too as well. So I'll just say that much, and Dawn, I'm sure she can add a lot. So.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for this question. Ron Purser has written a lot about the concept of mindfulness and the ways in which mindfulness has proliferated in the world. And much like anything, we're human, and so we're tempted to exploit things out of greed, sometimes out of delusion, and also, the third factor, which we always talk about, is not respecting another culture. And so this we as contemporary mindfulness teachers in the world have developed something called an International Integrity Network, where we've actually spent some good quality time considering what is it that constitutes good practice. So there are some good practice guidelines that come out of the UK. I don't think mindfulness itself can actually be exploited, because it is an inherent human quality. But much like anything, I just recommend to people that they take a good long look at what the teacher is offering, to take a good long look at the kinds of training that Michael's referring to, history of training. I feel like a neophyte, and I've only been teaching for 20 years. It's never over. And so if somebody takes a weekend course and then is offering you mindfulness training, much like the Buddha initially invited, is like, experiment for yourself. Really take the practices into your heart. See what benefits are happening for you. But some of the criticism is unfounded. Some of the criticism is really unfounded, and some of it isn't. So trust your own intuition, trust your own awakening, trust your own moments of enlightenment or enlightening moments. Thank you for that question.
Well, we have more questions now. They started to roll in. Okay, another one is, the lack of mindfulness is often considered to be a symptom of people with autism. Could you speak to the issue?
So, Michael, I don't know if you have anything to talk about, like research-wise. I feel like I can speak to having some work at with people with autism, including a grandson. And there's much written about both a lack of mindfulness, a lack of attention, or over attention. And so one of the ways in which mindfulness is defined is as an lack of mindfulness isn't mindlessness, but also an over-identification with something. And so on occasion, people become over-identified with a particular experience. But from an academic point of view, I can't really comment on the research. Michael, are you familiar with this?
I am not familiar with mindfulness and autism. I'm more familiar with autism and diet, because I do a lot of work in microbiome science, and also autism. A lot of people would argue, I know this is not answering directly your question, but a lot of evolutionary folks talk about autism being one of those diseases of civilization, just like heart disease would be. And it's the many of us have genes that express for many different kinds of things, right? For different kinds of conditions. One condition could be maybe autism. One condition could be, glioblastoma for brain cancer. Another one could be for long life expectancy, or one can be for the inability to as I said, metabolize caffeine. So I look at the body as a very dynamic system, very dynamic. I've got one graduate student, PhD student now, who's working on a dissertation on diet and autism, not here, but back in the States. And so she's done some of that work around there, and I've kind of done some of the work around there too. So it in a sense is, like a lot of things, we may have the genetic variants for it, whatever the disease may be, but it may be that food, stress, the lack of something, or a change in environment may activate a condition like autism. So that's about as much as I know about autism. I don't know how or why it could be related to, I guess, the shutting down of the brain and the inability to be mindful. And that sure would be an interesting question, though. But thank you for that question.
In a similar vein, another question is, I imagine that mindfulness and meditation could be useful for people with ADHD. Have there been any studies relating to this?
You want to take that, Dawn?
My apologies. Right now I'm not remembering the authors, but definitely this training in attention has been a very helpful situation for people who have challenges with paying attention. In particular, so I'm going to go back to the autism question in a little bit. So there was a study that's floating into the back of my mind in which individuals who had an ability to not pay attention and also a great deal of trouble with emotion regulation were trained in mindfulness of the body. In particular, they were trained in a particular kind of intervention that's called soles of the feet, in which when standing, they began to become familiar with the experience of knowing the sensations of their feet in their socks, in their shoes on the ground. And that particular training in that intervention reduced their emotional volatility sufficiently enough that they actually were able to move from institutionalized living into community living. So this ability to notice the tendency to have visceral experiences of emotion and be able to regulate them through attention in the body has been super helpful for individuals.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, a number of people have to dig out the work now, but a number of people have actually written about, all the diagnoses that come from the DSM, whatever version it is these days. A number of them now are looking at rather than autism, or rather than labeling someone with hyperactivity disorder, what some folks are beginning to label it with is movement or environmental deficit disorder, meaning that that children are not outside enough, which begins to really change the way that their brain works, and we've known these for years, that little kids that play and they run and they balance have these neuronal growth spurts in their brain when they're outside. These are things that we've known for years, looking at animal models, then looking at children models when you do scans of kids during their developmental stages. So again, that's why I say that I haven't looked at like ADHD in that context myself, but I have read, or a number of scholars have talked about it now, more in the sense of, rather than some kind of attention deficit disorder, it's more of an environmental or outdoor environment disorder, that kids aren't getting enough playtime and stuff, which makes sense when you start looking at the how the brain works and how it grows and when it grows and that sort of thing. So the lack of stimulation really creates a lot of issues in terms of brain growth and neuronal growth. So.
Okay, another question. Does it concern you that mindfulness is used synonymously with awareness in reference to things that have nothing to do with the concept?
Maybe I could just say, for me, I don't see a difference, first of all, between awareness and mindfulness. It's kind of one and the same thing in many ways. It's just context and when a person is doing kind of awareness training, which a lot of people call it, they don't even call it mindfulness training or concentration training. That's done in other contexts, right? It's done in contexts where, people aren't actually doing mindfulness per se practice, but they're focusing on achieving a certain kind of level of competence by paying attention to whatever they're doing, whether it's neurosurgery or whether it's, people who are engaging in diffusing situations. They're paying attention to several things at once: person's body language, facial expression, the time of the day when they begin to diffuse a dangerous situation. So it's never called mindfulness there. It's all about awareness of the situation. So I think they're one and the same. So.
Okay, great. This question is from a school social worker who's developing a back-to-school plan. The question is, do you have any specific recommendations for children returning to school?
It's just such a great initiative, the Mindfulness in Schools initiative. I think one of the things that I really believe that mindfulness training can do for us as individuals when we're in these situations is to really begin to pay attention to what's going to be needed, right? To notice both in a funneled way and in a broader way what the children are going to need as they return to school. I've been thinking about the implications of this pandemic on our children and our health systems and all of it. And there's some really great lessons that may be emerging about the kinds of ways in which we need to decolonize the structures that have been existing, and how we might be able to pay attention to what smaller class sizes might be doing for us. What will the children need? How will we mitigate the emotional implications? So you as a teacher creating the scenario for your classroom, when we talk about the difference between awareness and mindfulness, mindfulness is the awareness that arises when we actually have an open ability to look at all of the factors that need to be present for the young people emerging. And I know Michael has so much more in his decolonizing mindfulness work that will be contributing to these inevitable and beautiful evolution of our culture.
So thank you, Donna. And I want to just sort of add a bit to that. I was a teacher's aide years ago, and I was a kid. Miyagi was once a child too. So one of the things I know about the science of exercise is that we should never isolate mindfulness practice as something that kids do sitting, right, in the classroom. I think kids coming back to school, I always like with my own children, it's kind of like Cesar Milan, if you've ever heard of him. He's a dog trainer. But I think about it, my own kids when they were little, and I've got little kids now. I always think discipline, exercise, and then love, right? But for kids, I think coming back to school, I really believe that, play. Those things are so critical. So critical. If you want to do these kids a favor, in my estimation, even though I have this great sort of belief in mindfulness, do not sit them in a chair and make them start practicing mindfulness practices first day. The first thing they need is they need to exercise and play, reacquaint themselves with one another in the ground, in the safety of the place. They need to run. They need to laugh. They need to move. I'll recommend a reading to you. It's called Spark. It's written by this guy, John Rately, who is an MD, who wrote this great book back in 2013. I think that's a new edition of it. It's called The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise in the Brain. I don't know if Rately says this, but I'm not. I remember I'd have to find the source again. But mindfulness is even more. It's even from a neurological point of view, it's even more effective when someone goes on a nice long run or a run and then comes back and relaxes for a while and then sits and goes into a meditative practice by sitting and focusing on your breath. Why does that work? Well, because what science tells us is that with children, they need to play. And if they have good feelings coming out of that play, they sit down and they meditate on that good feeling, they're going to keep it the rest of the day because they've preserved those neurons of fun in the brain. I'm just calling it that, right? That's what I call it, the neurons of play, the neurons of fun. But you can think holistically. I always think holistically, right? Mindfulness sitting practice or even walking practice is one thing. But in order for the kids to get the dopamine levels up, the serotonin levels up, and to be expressing, norepinephrine at a healthy level so their alertness is all about fun and games rather than fear, they've got to run. They've got to play. Once they do that, the exercise, then you give them the love of sitting mindfulness so that they learn how to bring that all back to the center, right? That's what I recommend. That's what I tell people because that's just the way I am. I'm a runner. I've been a meditator for over 45 years. I've been a runner longer than that. And when I saw the science about how running, increases neurogenesis, and then how you sit after helps preserve the brains that you've grown, there you go. It's all free, right? You make a better brain, you make a better kid, you make a better situation, and so on. So, but I really recommend reading the book Spark, The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise in the Brain by John Rately.
Okay, another question in a similar vein is what can individuals and organizations do specifically to bring mindfulness back into the mainstream education and healthcare system?
Dawn?
So as a co-founder of something called the Compassion Project, which is an innovative organizational change and development initiative designed to reacquaint healthcare providers with their inherent ability to be mindful. I think that it's very important for us to create the conditions for us to have solid reflection on any process that we're engaging in. And so this broadening our awareness, broadening the capacity, having conversations at all levels of an organization, including the people that we serve, to really begin to listen to the voices and to not always draw upon experts as the decision makers. I think this is a very fundamental experience that we need to get back to community in our organizations. And that's why I think Michael and I are both so passionate about bringing a Center for Mindful Decolonization and Reconciliation to the University of Manitoba. This capacity that each of us has to actually pause to see what's forming our thoughts. Mindfulness has 4 foundations. Foundations of the body, foundations of what we turn towards and turn against, mindfulness of thoughts and emotions and how they're formed and how they affect how we perceive, and then mindfulness of the ultimate teachings, the universal teachings of connection and interconnection. The world needs this right now. And if there's ever been a time in which we've been more aware of the interconnectedness of all things, it's been through this pandemic. And so, as I was saying earlier to the teacher about paying attention to the lessons that are emerging from this crisis in our world and where it is that we have been going astray and what we need to do to begin to take care of ourselves, the future generations, and the earth itself, is to create the conditions for us to actually hear each other's voices and not discount each other's experiences. Michael?
Yeah, so let me add something too, because I'm kind of a pragmatic person in many ways. First thing you want to do is tell them you can get a grant. Get a grant. It's something that has enough evidence base. If you put together a program in the school, it doesn't have to be anything like it's huge or anything, but it'll bring in some resources there. Second thing is bring in the evidence. Get your administrators and your teachers and your parents on board. Show them the evidence. There's a lot of evidence. What I showed today was just a smidgen of the evidence. there's enough evidence to show you that it increases productivity, compassion in an organization. You get better organizational health. People work together better. They anticipate problems. It's easier to get people through problems and easier to get people to work together. When I was in Northern California a few years ago, I was teaching mindfulness at a reservation school up in Klamath, California, on the Yurok reservation. One of the things I did with these Yurok kids is I hooked them up with my students, my graduate students at Humboldt State University. I was teaching a mindfulness class, graduate class. So my graduate students would travel to the classroom and do sits with the students and walks with the students and do that. So you hook your class up with other students. It's a global world we live in. No one should live in isolation. We should know what other schools are doing, what they're doing, and people that I've seen are more than happy to engage in a conversation and tell you what they're doing. And the final thing is give administration and teachers the language of neuroscience. Not just about mindfulness, give them the language of neuroscience. They should know all the parts of the brain that are affected, that are improved, that are corrected, that are changed structurally and functionally when people engage in mindfulness. That's not a hard thing to do. That's something Don and I are working on in our Center for Mindful Decolonization. We're doing all these things. And we're doing it because we know it can make schools, organizations, communities better places. That's what social work is all about, is to try to help people achieve a sense of justice, a sense of, connection with one another, to begin to decolonize, all of these harmful situations that people have gone through for long periods of time, and to bring indigenous people and settlers together to work together on some of the common problems we have as humanity. So that's the thing is, get them involved in understanding it's way beyond mindfulness. It's a better world. There are so many payoffs that happen with that. Mindfulness just is one step toward that, achieving what we want to achieve as a human society. So.
I'm just going to ask two more questions here. The next one, also from a health-related point of view, this is a follow-up to one of the previous questions that you answered already, is I also find it relevant, or mindfulness relevant, to obsessive compulsive and avoidant personality disorders. Can you please convey your opinions on this?
Well, certainly there's some work around the similarities between addiction and obsessive compulsive disorders. And there's work done that was started by Alan Marlatt called urge surfing. And it's the ability to pay attention to the experience of the rise of
No. So Dawn's frozen. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
There we are, back again. I think we both disappeared this time, Michael. Yeah. So that, if you're interested, I would just look up that work.
Let me show you a book that I used in one of my classes at Humboldt State University in Northern California. So. Sorry, it's by this, Fabrizio Diadana, who's the editor. It's a clinical handbook of mindfulness. This is a book that I used in my MSW class when I was teaching, getting my students to kind of learn more about mindfulness, and then to begin to engage in learning the practices, and then eventually bringing it to their agencies. Here's one book. So there's a lot of really important conditions that a lot of really experienced clinicians have worked with using mindfulness. This is another person that I've used in classes too. So her work, she's the editor of this, is, see if I can get the name up here, gosh. Illuminating the Theory and Practice of Change. And this is by, what's her name, Barr. But again, it's assessing mindfulness practice, mindfulness and acceptance processes in clients. So there's really a lot of really good accessible readings out there. I'm not an expert certainly in compulsive disorders, but I know that Dioddana's book has a whole chapter and a lot of really good research on compulsive disorders and the use of mindfulness, and some very good research findings. So very encouraging.
And the final question is, could you please introduce effective methods of practicing mindfulness in the current circumstances, perhaps without having a trainer beside you?
I'd love to speak to that. Right now, if you Google mindfulness resources online, there are so many excellent, some of the great teachers in the world are offering freely the experience of having accompaniment. But, you know, I think one of the things I love most is short times, many times. Every single one of us is capable of actually pausing for a moment. There's a brief practice that I love. It's called the stop practice. The first letter is an S, and we just stop whatever we're doing. The second, T, take a breath. The O is just observe what's transpiring within you, what's transpiring around you. And the P is then proceed with just a little bit more clarity of what's called for in this moment. So wonderful practice to use if you're home and parenting, or you're stuck in quarantine with your family and finding it just that your irritability is up a little bit. These are totally accessible and very useful. And the more times you stop, the greater the capacity that you'll have to actually access your wisdom and respond rather than react to situations. Thank you.
Not just second that too. I think a lot of the success that people have in maintaining a practice, like Dawn's saying, is to break it up. I mean, there's no reason for the way we live right now to try to to try to put an hour here, an hour there. That it doesn't work. Especially when our brains have been sculpted to be on the alert all the time, and we have what they call the monkey mind. It's always sort of active. So I always say to folks, it's like, for me, it's like running or meditation, is that if I do short pieces, like, and I do all day, really do the same thing, do 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there, 10 minutes there. By the time I've ended, my fifth time, it's 50 minutes during the day that I do it, but not every day. Why? Because it's like running. You don't have to do it every day. Once you begin to build the neural networks, they're there, right? And all you have to do is sort of help them bloom a little bit. That's just how the brain works. So don't ever feel like, if you can't do a half-hour meditation that you failed. If you can do 30 seconds, you've succeeded. If you've done 10 seconds, you've succeeded. And all you want to do is, just to increase that a little by little. So some people, like the Buddhist, Tibetan monks, these guys are the ultra marathon people. They can do 10,000 hours, in 2 years' time or 3 years' time or whatever it is. That's just not for most of us. Or they can go on retreats for 90 days. That's not for most of us. But the person that can be consistent by doing it, as much as they can every day, are the people that are going to succeed. Just like running or swimming or any other activity. There are thresholds. There are chemical thresholds that happen in the body. When you sit too long, you're going to raise levels of cortisol, and it's going to be counterproductive. You don't want to do that. You want to sit long enough, and practice until you reach a point like, I can't do it anymore. Then you back away. It's like, for me, I do high intensity interval training. I know when I run really hard for 2 minutes or 5 minutes, really hard, that's about the extent that I want to go, run a hard run. Same thing with meditation. I've meditated for hours, but I also have a threshold to know when I begin to lose, the meaning, and begin to lose the benefit to it after so many minutes. And then I'll just shut down, go upon my day, and then I'll do it again. That's how you get for me, that's my own way of getting the most benefits out of it. So.
Well, thank you very much. That is a wonderful way to end. So thank you, Dr. Gillibert and Dawn, for your very interesting and enlightening presentation and mindfulness meditation practice. I will definitely be using that stop approach that you mentioned, Dawn. And thank you to all of you for participating this afternoon. We will be sending you a link to today's session, as well as a link to a survey where you can share your thoughts and feedback. Please do provide your feedback, as it's the only way that we're able to improve. Next week on May the 27th, our speaker will be Dr. James Ferguson. He's the Deputy Director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies and professor in our Department of Political Studies. And he will be speaking on the defense and security implications during a pandemic. So have a great week and please stay safe. Thank you.